Welcome back to the Security Unhappy Hour, where we bring together a group of security professionals and naturally cheery folks to discuss topics in the cybersecurity community, share knowledge, learn, teach, and exchange ideas. Before we get started, it's important to point out that the views and opinions expressed on the Security Unhappy Hour and related websites are those of the hosts, guests, and authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any one company. Today, my co-hosts, Lisa Bradley, Katie Noble, Krobe, and I are going to talk about terminology, the terminology that we use in the security industry, why understanding this terminology is important and using it correctly is critical. And I think this is a pain point we all feel, right?
Yes. I feel it. Yeah. All the time.
And why do you guys think that it's important to use the right terms? Why do the right terms matter?
Words have meanings.
That's a good answer. I can't top it.
But that's the thing though. Like, words have meanings, but when you're talking like the dictionary definition of a word, that has a different meaning than like the industry accepted standard, right? So meanings have evolved to be something that may not correspond with what like the dictionary means. So if that's the case, then I may say something and my lawyers may say something, and that means absolutely nothing to somebody who's not familiar with the jargon.
Right.
Yeah. I would like all like medical professionals to use the same terminology when they're treating me. It's a thing I have about quality of care. And I think the same thing about security. You know, it's just like what you said about using industry terminology properly is helps to convey the point quickly and efficiently and puts everybody on the same page.
And within our profession in information security, there are particular nuances when you use one word over another, even though to a layperson they may seem synonymous. They do have very particular meanings. They're much more precise when we say vulnerability or weakness. They have very particular.
Hardening. Yep. Yeah. Throw that one in there. Yep.
And some of the basic ones, right? Like vulnerable is it, you know, what do we mean when we say something is vulnerable? What is that?
I feel vulnerable.
But you feel the noun vulnerable versus the adjective vulnerable, which in the cybersecurity realm, we're talking about the adjective vulnerable, not the noun. Yeah.
I'm a math major, so all that grammar stuff.
Look at that liberal education coming out. It's there. Yeah, that's right.
Let me write you a sonnet about it.
So it's worth pointing out, I think, to everybody that listens that we're going to talk about some of the specific terms, and we're going to give you the definitions of those terms as well that are used or were defined by industry groups within the space of cybersecurity. No hints of where we got it, but I'll just say we got it from other industry groups.
Yeah, a lot of them we stole from FIRST, which maybe then came from
open sourced.
But some of us are part of FIRST, and so
right.
maybe we wrote the definition just so
we might have wrote the definition. You're right.
Or perhaps we used another widely recognized industry body that has an amazing common body of knowledge that talks about cybersecurity in depth. I don't know.
Like
maybe.
Yeah. There's a lot of choices. The nice thing is we're all usually part of all of them, so we can influence it to try to be consistent.
Yeah. So NIST is one, the CVSS SIG for under first.org and other SIGs under first.org, like the CSIRT SIG, will help to define vulnerabilities. ISC squared, another excellent source.
International Information Security Software Certification Consortium.
Yep.
That sounds right. That sounds right. It's too long to be wrong. So
Actually, I screwed it up. It isn't software.
So
information systems security, bastards.
Close enough. Everybody will believe you because it sounded so
professionally right.
So vulnerable. A component is vulnerable if it contains a weakness or flaw that can be exploited given the necessary conditions and or exposure. That's sort of like one of the basic things when you're starting to break down the definition of a vulnerability is knowing whether something is vulnerable or not. And that component being software or hardware that is the bearer of that vulnerability that you would fix or patch or otherwise would
or a
mitigate.
process.
Yeah, right. Or process. That's a really great point, actually. Yeah. Right.
I think some of the key things that are missing sometimes in like customer contracts or terminology that I see is the the exploited word, and that's sort of key in here to differentiate between a weakness and and a real like vulnerability. You following me or no?
No, I am. I was just thinking about how sometimes I find that people take the term exploited as maybe to the point where you have to prove it. Ideally, when a vulnerability is reported or a potential vulnerability is reported, you're able to prove that the exploit can occur by exercising the POC. Ideally, but there are times when you have somebody who is a subject matter expert that can look at the vulnerability and the code where the vulnerability would manifest itself, and they know with beyond a shadow of a doubt that vulnerability could be exploited. And you don't necessarily have to go through the exercise. It's a best practice, though, in my mind, to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
So I feel we've already gotten ahead of ourselves.
We have a little bit. We're jumping a little bit.
We're talking about vulnerability, but we haven't explained what a vulnerability is. And we're talking about exploitation and weaknesses, but we haven't explained what those things are. So, shall we back up just a tad?
Like, we should have maybe had a screen pop up of a slide.
Would that be like a real video podcast would do that?
Yeah. Like,
we will
so
be might not be real
so
time.
maybe we clarify and say, like, first and foremost, when we're talking about these terms, we're talking about them in the format that we use them in the cybersecurity world versus the format that they're used in the dictionary in other industries or other areas of life, right? So when we say vulnerability, we are talking about a cybersecurity vulnerability, not don't have like a physical security vulnerability. Maybe you don't have like CCTV or like I don't know, remote sensors, right? Those things are like physical security vulnerability issues. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about specific instances within software, hardware, industrial control systems. So a cybersecurity vulnerability has a unique set of definitions to describe what it is. So all of the things we're going to talk about, all the different terms, we're talking about them in the realm of cybersecurity, IT, and defense. So keep that in mind as we go through these things.
Right, like you were saying earlier, if you looked up at the dictionary, it wouldn't be the same thing that we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Scrum pulls out the dictionary.
And maybe, we kind of teed up a couple of words that are also part of this core. Risk is another one that I think we should talk about. Risk is an element of evaluating an issue, but
I heard there might be a really great podcast about that topic in particular.
Yeah.
Is there now? We actually did address this in one of our previous podcasts.
Yeah,
risk versus CVSS, but
basically a risk is a possibility that something bad could happen, and there's two main formulas people derive it. It's either your vulnerability multiplied by the threat, and which we'll get to in a minute, or it's likelihood times impact. So how probable the situation is to manifest, and then if it does, how bad could it be?
I guess it's worth noting that risk takes a lot of other factors into consideration beyond CVSS, and we did talk about that in great detail in another podcast. So
CVSS does not equal risk.
Yes, God, please.
That's right. Yeah. It's severity, not impact.
I feel like there's some like a good blog about that somewhere.
Yeah, I know.
There probably is.
Maybe.
Okay, maybe. Should we dive into what vulnerable is, followed by vulnerable components, followed by weaknesses, and then risk and exposure, and then vulnerability versus threat? I feel like these are things we should talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we look at risk, we already talk about vulnerability, so we need to probably say vulnerability right after vulnerable.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I talked about vulnerable and vulnerable component. Weakness we didn't touch on yet, but that's error in software, hardware implementation, code design, or architecture that, depending on exposure, could be exploited by an attacker. Right.
I think the key word is could be, right? That's the differentiator here.
Yeah.
Is that it could be exploited. A weakness isn't always a vulnerability, but a vulnerability is always a form of a weakness, right? Did I say that right?
Weakness is a part of a.
I think that was okay, right?
Yeah.
This is Scotch all over again. all Scotch is whiskey, but not all whiskey is Scotch.
Yeah, right.
There we go. So when we say vulnerable, what we mean is a cybersecurity vulnerability is a component that is vulnerable if it contains a weakness or a flaw that can be exploited given the necessary conditions or exposures.
Right.
Which is different than a misconfiguration.
Right. And we're going to talk about that too later, right? Misconfiguration, right, versus a vulnerability.
Yep.
The vulnerable component we talked about being software hardware component that bears the vulnerability and that would be patched. Again, not necessarily it would be patched doesn't mean you have to patch it.
Yeah, I sort of read this and thought, you could potentially patch a vulnerable component through a different aspect of the product, or protect it, or reduce the risk of it,
or apply mitigating control or compensate.
Right, or mitigating control, exactly. So, I mean, even though the vulnerable part is part of the component, it doesn't mean that the solution always has to be part of that.
That's right. And in some cases, the solution is EOL, move on to the next version.
Potentially, yes, that too.
Or the business could accept the risk and elect not to fix it because they don't think the probability or the impact is severe enough.
Right. There's a lot of companies that are completely risk-based and saying the chances of this being exploited is very, very low. And we don't think it's a big risk to our customers. And it may take a year to fix it. So we're not going to do it. And they'll accept that risk.
Right.
So risk exception policy.
Yeah, and risk has many dimensions, I think, is also the point, right? You as the customer have risk factors. You as the vendor have risk factors. The user has different risk factors. It's all risk is multi-faced.
Risk is in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
Everybody has their own risk profile.
Well said. Right. So exposure. Did we touch on exposure already?
Oh no, exposure. Oh, I hate exposures. Oh, it's the worst. Go ahead.
That's being vulnerable.
To expose myself again.
Yeah.
We don't. No.
Let's not go there.
It's a family show. Not. Being vulnerable or exposed to damage, threat, caused by a threat agent exploiting a weakness in the system is called exposure. So what's the key part of that definition that stands out to you all?
I have never understood this. I don't. When it comes to like the difference between a vulnerability and exposure, I have always put exposure in the same bucket as like misconfigurations. I see them as like they're not set things. Like if you have, if you have like your Oracle database exposed to the outside world, that to me is an exposure, but it's not something that's a vulnerability because you can't assign a CVE to it, right? That's you set that up wrong. So technically, like you have an exposure, but you shouldn't have set it up that way. Or like like you your RDPs are available to the outside world, or someone can hack into your nanny cam. Like those are exposures. But
looking at it from like a fair risk assessment approach, exposure is how possible is it that an attacker is going to stumble across this weak scenario. And then you talk about motive and opportunity and traceability. There's a bunch of other factors that can jump into that if something is exposed, if I have a air-gapped system that has a weakness, the exposure of it is nil. I have to walk up and physically touch it. But if it's a system attached in the cloud, the probability somebody's going to stumble across it or actively seek it out is much higher.
I thought though I thought that would be more like how easily exploitable is it and not an exposure. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you use exposure in
I don't.
your world right now? I don't use it.
I use
I don't
it
either.
in terms of talking about threat actors.
Yeah, and it's
Okay.
funny because the CVE program, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures program, I sit on the board of directors of that program, and we don't catalog exposures and haven't
Weren't
for.
they talking about trying to change the name or acronym one time, like recently?
Yeah, that's
they
a
were.
real thing. Because we don't. The CVE program hasn't cataloged exposures in over 10 years
So it's
because
more of a
they're not
traditional name,
catalogable.
right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It was set up in
It-
1999, and so like they were cataloging exposures back then. But now, like, how would you even catalog that? You're gonna.
Alive back then.
There was like 6 computers hooked to the internet. I don't. And they were all at universities. I don't know. So I don't
I think
know.
it's an outdated word. Maybe it'll come back, if there's a new type of vulnerability that utilizes this word.
It's a very academic
yeah.
statement. So somebody from academia got their dissertation and their paper and their PhD funded because of this word. I don't know that it has relevance as much today.
What's the dictionary definition of it?
The dictionary.
Come on,
Well,
let's
let me
look up
tell you what my
exposure.
friend Merriam-Webster says.
Yeah.
You still know how to use that without Googling it? I only Google dictionary words now.
And I carried this thing around with me in
Just to be
college.
clear, we have received no funding or payment from Google for that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Or Merriam-Webster.
Expulsion,
Brought to
expressway.
you by Carl's
It
Training.
takes a while to look it up. Look at how long it's taking you. Tick tock, tick tock.
Exploit.
No,
A
exposure.
notable deed or act
Oh, that's
to
not what we're talking
make
about.
use of selfishly or unethically.
That's
what about
exploit. That's
exposure?
exploit. But what about exposure?
Me and Katie are on top of you for the right word.
Yeah. You gotta stay on task.
Exposure. An act of exposing or the state of being exposed.
How is that fair? You can't use the word in the dictionary.
A
In the definition.
position with respect to direction. An act of exposing a sensitive photographic image or plate. A film or plate exposed. Back in days of yore, when we had real cameras and daguerreotype machines where we would have these big tin plates and you would open the exposure for a certain.
So this is what I would say. If you are utilizing the word exposure in your security literature, we'd love to hear from you to know how you are. How about that? Now let's go on.
Yeah.
I agree.
That's a great plan. Thanks for the ask. So
need my 1996 dictionary again. Let me know.
Hang on to that, right? It's a collector's item.
I have a better one somewhere.
So that I think leads us to talk about vulnerability versus threat.
Oh, the big sexy topic.
Big vulnerability word, which is I think it carries a lot of weight when you classify something that's an issue as a vulnerability. That usually triggers a whole series of actions that a company needs to take or should take, right? So what's a vulnerability? And we just talked about part of the definition, right? It's a weakness or flaw in the functional behavior of a vulnerable computational component. That could be software or hardware.
Or firmware.
It can be exploited, resulting in a negative impact to the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an impacted component. Crow?
I prefer to define vulnerability as a weakness or absence of a safeguard in an asset that provides a higher potential or frequency of a threat occurring.
Oh, I've got another one that I prefer that's even easier to understand.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, Miss Katie.
It is a weakness that allows an entity, adversary, person, external influence, whatever you want to call it, to do something that was not intended by the original developer. Right?
Well, right, but
because if the component
about the word
behaving,
exploited, I'm worrying about the word exploited, not, I don't know, maybe it is exploited because they could do it, but if they could do it and do something bad, so what if they could do something and they get the same rights that they could do before?
That's not a vulnerability then.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Like,
Using
But
your
that's the whole point.
provision
So a
access.
vulnerability is
because they could do something more than what they were supposed
if
to
they
be
can
able
do
to
something that they were not supposed to be able to do, or something that was not intended by the original developer, then it's a vulnerability. If they are not able to do anything that they weren't able to do before, then it's a cool trick, bro. But
Well, what if
not
I'm
a
able to
vulnerability.
put, like, when it asks me for my first name, I'm able to put my first name and my middle name. That's not a vulnerability. Like, nothing bad's going to happen because of it. I'm
That's
just
just
saying,
Yeah,
like,
but that's where we get back to a misconfiguration, right? If it was set up that way. I think ultimately the other thing I think we left out is that when we talk about vulnerabilities, us in this community, we're typically talking about product vulnerabilities, which are like 0-day vulnerabilities, which are issues that no one has ever seen before. So they're vulnerabilities, they're in a specific product, whether that's hardware, software, whatever it is, but it's something in a product. It's not it's not a misconfiguration. It's not somebody set it up wrong or somebody didn't do, back-end validation on a website. That's not a vulnerability. If it's like hard-coded credentials, something along those lines, that would be a vulnerability. But like somebody being able to.
I found missing, maybe I missed this in yours, Crow, but I found missing from both was the calling out of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. I mean, that's the CIA triad, right? The security triad.
Well,
I feel like
I prefer the security quartet.
quartet. What's the
Confidentiality, integrity, availability, and
privacy?
auditability.
Oh, audibility. Really?
okay.
Tell us more. The audibility part.
If you can't audit, therefore you
Oh,
cannot guarantee the integrity of the
Audit.
system. You
Oh,
don't
like
know.
audit. Like audit,
see,
like,
Audible.
I wasn't thinking that on it.
dangerous.
Yeah.
Because when you say that, then like, oh man, because then like there are vulnerabilities that you can't detect because there's no like, so that's the tree falls in the forest.
It's related to repudiation, being able to trace somebody did an act.
How
so
do
a
you
lack
know
of that doesn't traditionally fall in CIA.
No, but that's interesting though, because that sort of goes back to being able to evaluate an issue to determine if it's a vulnerability, whether you observe it or with a certainty, right? I can audit that report and determine that CIA would be affected, or I can reproduce it. It's an auditable event or potential event, right?
Yeah, it's related to repudiation, which being able to prove someone at some time did something.
Did this, right?
Yeah, but like then you get into like vulnerabilities that I can watch someone do it, I can see it via proof of concept, but there's no auditable trace left behind, right? There's no log that it's not trackable. You can't go back and look at logs and see that
Somebody
it's there.
should fix that.
Yeah, they should.
That's interesting. I guess where I tend to always think is I think very narrow in this is like some people will say security defects, some people say security weakness, and people say security hardening, and then they say vulnerability. And I like they shouldn't be used interchangeably. And oftentimes I see that customers do use them interchangeably. A security defect could be a hardening type of issue or a vulnerability, right? Security defect doesn't mean that it's all automatically a vulnerability. That's how I look at it. I don't know. This is the problem. Maybe we're all different.
I defer to Miss Katie first.
Well, so hardening is like hardening is totally grammatically and defense language completely not here. Hardening is an action on behalf of the component. Yeah, it's a control. It's an action on behalf of the component that is vulnerable, right? It's where you're standing in the grammatical like spot here, right? So like
putting a fence around your house.
Yeah, it's a compensating control. You're hardening it. It's not but you would do that action because you didn't want kids on your front yard, right? So you're vulnerable to kids on your front yard and you don't want that. So you have to put a control in place, and that's hardening, and that hardening would be putting a fence up. So it's an action taken on behalf of the component, not the vulnerability. Those things they're on the other end of the spectrum there. One is the one point, and the other is the thing that is happening to the device.
Crow.
Does all that make sense? Go ahead.
I was talking about defect, though.
Back to Lisa's point about defect and flaw, depending on who you're talking to, if you talk to a developer and say vulnerability and threat, their eyes glaze over and they don't care. They understand bug, defect, and flaw. So if you're speaking to certain constituents, it's important to use the right terminology so you can effectively kind of convey. The academic meaning behind it is less important when you're trying to say, hey, Jack, you need to fix this problem in your code.
Right,
well,
sorry, Josh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No.
I was just thinking about, like, most engineers have a defect tracking system. When they do some kind of SDL exercise, their findings go into the defect tracking system. Some of their findings are actual vulnerabilities, and some of them are weaknesses or hardening that they need to do, but aren't vulnerabilities. Or a
non-security issue.
So they may call it a security defect, even though it's a hardening type of thing that they need to address and not a vulnerability. So that's what I'm saying. Like, we utilize these words a lot, and depending on what world you sit in, whether you're on a CSIRT or you're on an engineering team, they may think of them very differently. We think very strategically. For me, I want to call it a vulnerability. It's a vulnerability. It's a vulnerability, because I'm having this whole discussion with my SDL team. I'm CSIRT. I don't get it unless it's a valid vulnerability. If you go through your SDL findings and it's not a valid vulnerability, like, it's not me. Okay, go ahead.
I think I know where you're going with this, but go ahead, Katie, please.
It just seems like, is it possible that defect is pre-release and vulnerability is post-release?
No,
because I feel like
I'd love to think that, but most likely you have a CSIRT type of tracking system for the vulnerabilities, and you also have a defect tracking system for the engineering teams to actually address the vulnerability. At least for my world and a few of my past worlds, that's how it was. It wasn't one system.
A software defect is just a flaw in code. A vulnerability has a security aspect to it.
Yeah.
The developer doesn't care. A bug is a bug is a bug.
Yeah.
But I could still have, I think, and correct me if I'm missing your point, Lisa, I could have a defect in the security implementation of my product that is not a vulnerability. There's something about my product, it doesn't, the color of my fence is wrong, or, something like that, right? That does not impact confidentiality.
Oh no, I lost you all. What happened?
That was weird.
Internet.
I thought it was me. Total refresh.
We have a weakness.
Got something. But so that could be cataloged differently, and it would need to be cataloged differently by the development teams. And back to your point, what you were saying, Crow, the vulnerability itself has that security aspect to it. And really, ultimately, you're right. Weakness or flaw, anything could be categorized as a weakness or a flaw. But when you add that security element to it, you now have different, sometimes standards that you have to meet as a result of that. You have different
obligations.
Right. Different obligations, different laws. You have a different obligation to your customers, and you have a different legal responsibility to that issue. And you may want to prioritize that differently than you have other things because of those elements, right?
Which is usually why most companies have a separate CSIRT tracking system beyond just the defect system that an engineering team would have, so that you can do the proper handling of the issue if it is a valid vulnerability, which is, the right triage, making sure you're addressing it in all supported versions, making sure that you put a plan together, making sure you put a communication plan together, and do the right disclosure to be, have the transparency to your customer.
That should be a topic for a whole future conversation.
Future, but yes,
tracking, because there's a lot of different. Definitely. There's a lot of reasons why you would have a separate CSIRT tracking tool.
Right, but I think the terminology comes in the play of where you track it, how you track it.
So it sounds like what we've gotten to is that a vulnerability is a defect or a weakness or a flaw that has a security element to it that rises to the level of impacting security. Right? That's the difference.
I still think the key word that I love to include in every definition for vulnerability is exploitability. It can be exploited. That's like I hate to see definitions without that word.
I don't like that word at all.
Well,
that's a difference.
Definition. Let's talk about threats.
Yeah. So yeah, how does this?
Moving on, we'll agree to disagree.
What's the difference between those two?
Between what?
Vulnerability and threat.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I love this. Threat is an action as an external force acting upon a vulnerability, right? A threat is a thing, whether it's a person or an external, code or something running. It is an external force that's acting upon that vulnerability. It is not a vulnerability. The vulnerability in of itself is not the problem. I like to take like the body armor kind of thing. Like say you're in a knife fight, right? And you're wearing like body armor. That person who's trying to attack you with a knife, right? They're the threat. The knife is I think that's called the threat component or the tool of the threat, right? And then the vulnerability is that place where your body armor doesn't cover you all the way, right? That would be the vulnerability. And then the body armor itself is your compensating control or your mitigation, your hardening.
But wouldn't the threat be the threat to the body armor?
Ha ha ha!
Yeah.
Full circle.
The threat to the body armor, though, would be a bullet, right? And the threat agent would be the person who actually fires the gun.
Why are you bringing a gun to Katie's knife fight?
Well, she used body armor, so that's where I'm going with it. Sorry, everybody, but
You lost me at gun and
Getting all
body
Sean
armor.
Connery on us.
Yeah.
So I actually go that the other way, Josh. And I think NIST agrees with me. That the threat agent is the bullet, and the threat is the guy with the gun.
Threat actor.
Well, no.
Right.
I think they just define that as the threat,
No.
and then the threat agent
so
is
the threat. The definition that I captured for this was the potential damage or harm that may occur as a result of exploiting an existing vulnerability. That's threat. Threat agent is the one who exploits the vulnerability to compromise the security, is called the threat agent.
Oh, I would have thought of been the
This
threat
came from
actor.
NIST, by the
I would
way.
have been thought of as the actor and not an agent.
Well, so I think threat is a category, though. It's an external force, and so like threat actor implies a person, right, or a person, organization, a thing. It's a noun, right? That's a threat actor.
Oh, how about
like
this?
malware.
It says a threat agent is also called a threat actor.
Yeah. See, okay, those are the same to me.
Any person or thing that acts or has the power to act to cause, carry, transmit, or support a threat.
Let me note, if we expand beyond the cyber in traditional security, a threat can come from people. It could be some type of technical problem, or it could be environmental.
Right. It says natural event. It could be a natural event.
Yeah. But it's a category. So to say threat actor or threat agent implies one of those particular influences that you mentioned, whether that's a person or a natural force or whatever it is. So threat is threat is a influence, an external influence acting upon, right? And then I don't know. I've got my NIST guide out.
Well, I'm looking
curious.
So the example that it had an example with the definition, and it said an intruder that searches the trash and found a classified document could use this document to cause embarrassment to the company and harm its reputation.
Sure.
This is a threat. Yeah, and he's a jerk. Another example is insecure protocol that transmits data in clear text. If an attacker exploits this fact and could manage to steal the data that's being transmitted through this insecure channel, that would also be described as a threat.
Okay, I have the NIST 800 special publication up. And I have threat is defined as any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact organizational operations, including mission, functions, image, or reputation, organizational assets, individuals, or other organizations, or a nation through an information system via unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, modification, information, or denial of service. That all sounds like you can just, if you are ever lost and confused and think no one loves you, you can find yourself in that definition. That definition is so broad that it has almost no value. And then it further goes on to talk about the threat source. And this is where I was confused just a moment ago whenever you said, Josh.
Agent/source.
threat.
I've been seeing that in this. Yep.
But now NIST says in NIST 800, it says the intent and method targeted at an intentional exploitation of a vulnerability or a situation and method that may accidentally trigger a vulnerability. This is synonymous with threat agent. And that's
There's my exploitation word. Did you see my exploitation word got in there?
Exact words.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at the glossary. It's very easy to look up the NIST glossary, just so you know, online.
I love NIST.
Yeah. Threat source, threat agent.
Yeah, they're okay.
Except when they give you 3 different definitions for the same thing.
Well, that's just like the regular dictionary, right?
Well, at least they're not using the word in the like exposure like Merriam-Webster was. So like can we agree that like that these are different parts
the Riverside
of speech?
edition.
that
the
these are
river,
different
look up words.
Different parts of speech, right? That the threat is an external force acting on, and the vulnerability is the internal thing that is vulnerable. Weakness, yeah.
Weakness. Yeah.
Point of weakness in your infrastructure.
Right. That can be
that can be exploited.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so they're very different. So when your organization says conflates vulnerability and threat, now you can set them straight.
Put the smackdown on them.
Now, what's the difference between a misconfiguration and a vulnerability?
Dumbassery.
Don't ask me.
Oh.
Who wanted to bring that one up? I wanted to bring the CSIRT
A
versus
misconfiguration
PSIRT word.
Isn't necessarily a vulnerability in and of itself. That's
Yeah. Agreed. A misconfiguration means you didn't set it up right.
Yeah.
Like it's not something that was a security flaw.
Well,
yeah. It may be exploitable, but it's not a flaw.
So it may be exploitable. So like a misconfiguration may be exploitable. Like in some cases, cross-site scripting, right? Or SQL injection. Those are misconfigurations because it wasn't set up properly to begin with, right? Or if you have your Wi-Fi at home, right? If you didn't set it up to have password protection, it's misconfigured.
Oh crap! I gotta go do that. Hold on.
Exactly.
I think I think one of the things
but technically not a product vulnerability, not a CVE-able product vulnerability.
Right. I think what's interesting is that if you're like a user of software, a lot of the product lines do a security configuration guide or some kind of guidance along with it, and you should follow it to better protect yourself because sometimes they can't be secure by default, which could be a whole nother conversation, but I'm just saying sometimes it happens. So you got to figure the configuration guide or follow it and then do the right tweaks to it to make sure that you're secure to the level that you want to be, because they'll often give you different levels, like you want a low, medium, or high. You could do that in your browser. What kind of security do you want? You could do that.
Yeah, it's a user configuration. But then also there are things like, I remember there was a law a couple of years ago, and I think it was California, came out and said like, look, this has to be a secure out of the box. You can't like, and it was probably on routers.
IoT, I think it was IoT.
Yeah, and it says like you have to, the vendor has to set it up so that when you first open it, it asks you, what's your password? It doesn't give you the option of not doing it. You have to actually go in and turn off the password rather than, and so that's like secure by default, right? That's a configuration issue. But there are there's requirements in some cases around some products where the policy and the law has gotten, the big arm of the law has gotten involved and said like things have to be secure out of the box. You can't just
the boggle with that is we live in a global society and everybody has slightly different rules. And what is required for security in one part of the globe is not necessarily the same.
Yep.
So that makes it very challenging depending on where you're peddling your products and services.
So if you're GDPR, then we all now get to deal with I accept your cookies.
Oh my gosh, it's so annoying. So
Cookies
many
are so
pop-ups
delightful.
all the time.
My cookies.
So, no,
I'm gonna make you some rum balls, Josh.
Bless your heart.
The best of the cookies.
So that's the difference between a misconfiguration and a vulnerability. A vulnerability, again, is a flaw or defect that rises to the level of a security, of an impact to security through exploitability that was not intended by the original developer, right? Where a misconfiguration is something oftentimes the user has influence over.
Right. Yeah, the security features are there, the controls are there, they're just not applied based on the instructions. Now, it could be that the controls could be there, but the instructions are lacking. Mm-hmm. Which case would that be a vulnerability?
Sometimes. So there's the difference. When I worked for the govs,
like undocumented feature, is that what you're going for?
No, I'm thinking about, if somebody doesn't tell me, I'm going to use a really basic example, right? If I have a gate that I put up around my house and I have a fence with a lock, but nobody tells me that there's a lock and nobody tells me how to use it.
No, you have a sticker. Because we're idiots here and we have to have a sticker.
Now, if I had a sticker, well, so speaking of idiots then, so what if I had a lawnmower and there was not a sticker on it that told me you cannot start the lawnmower, pick it up, and cut my hedges with it?
Don't put your foot underneath it.
Don't
stick your hand in it. Don't have it running while you clean the blades and the grass out of it.
There you go, right?
It's just sort of like the one where you put the kid in the bumbo and they say don't set the bumbo on top of the table.
The bumbo was great.
Bumbo was great, but don't put it on top of a table.
Some dumbass ruined it for everybody.
I'm just going back to nature finds a way, guys. Go on, Josh. What were you saying?
Sorry.
No, I was just saying, so if I basically don't document that, if I don't tell people about the security feature that's there to protect them, they don't know to implement it. Therefore, to them, there is no security control for me to implement to protect myself against it. And so to me, there is a security vulnerability there, but it's in documentation.
Have we ever issued a CVE for documentation?
See, there we go. Now we're into. No, we have not.
That.
No,
yeah,
we have not.
Yeah.
And now we're going back into the technically speaking, your skin is vulnerable to a knife, but that does not reach the level of a CVE. It's not a cybersecurity vulnerability by the definition, the accepted industry.
I love that Katie knows all the definitions.
What if it was a cyber knife?
Right. I got asked these things all the time. So yes, is it a problem? Sure. Is it a vulnerability? Maybe it's a vulnerability in the noun sense of the vulnerability in your security, your implementation of your security program at your organization. Sure. It's a policy or guidance vulnerability, but I don't know, but I would not call that a product vulnerability.
I would say in general, my guidance is try to be secure as you can out of the box and make the
security by design
customer or user be the one to turn off a security feature if they want to. But I don't even want them to be allowed to, but because sometimes they need other functionality that they want to have happen, they need to turn off a security feature to be able to do that functionality. It's sort of like when I go to run a program or install a program, my thing pops up and says, you need to stop your VPN or you need to stop your Norton scanning right now for you to install it. It's the same concept. I'm accepting that risk to download what I want to do. I don't know.
What if I'm sending a interstellar probe out past Pluto? Do I need to have everything secure by default if no one's ever going to access it?
Because maybe they will.
Ooh, maybe they will.
But
Maybe
I
there's
think of it
somebody
like,
out there.
I feel like there are a lot of products where it's like,
We are
my
not.
mom does not need to know how to turn off how to turn off the security proposals that are in place to
Recommend
protect her.
settings. Click.
Yeah. And I don't
Run,
want to make that
install.
too easy for her. And like
Yeah.
there are a lot of settings that are there to protect the end user that they don't necessarily know about. And to improve the user experience, it's probably better that they don't know about it. So like when we talk about, like, Josh, what you were saying before, I was thinking about like default credentials versus hard-coded credentials, right? So like, yeah, so technically like hard-coded credentials are CVE-able because it's a
Terrible
configuration. Well, that you can get a CVE for that.
No,
Like,
not that it's a CVE. It's a terrible idea to do that.
it's a terrible idea to do it, right? Exactly. And so like that's one of those weird threshold breaking kind of situations where if you have hard-coded credentials, you can get a CVE for that because it doesn't allow the user to be able to configure it in a secure way.
So this was an important distinction, I think, for people to know, right? And especially the cybersecurity versus other types. Yeah, the word cyber.
So we're going there. Oh, we're going there.
So what are some other definitions that are that would be important for people to know that are either new to this field or work with?
Do you want to know my
CSIRT,
definition,
CSIRT.
my favorite and my
CSIRT,
least favorite
CSIRT.
definition? PSIRT. Probe, come on, I'm ready for it. I hate the acronym PSIRT. I don't deal with incidents.
Yep.
No.
You absolutely do.
All right, hold on.
I'm ready for it. I'm ready
Let me
for
go.
it.
Let me go get my ITIL book, and I'll explain to you what an incident really is.
I deal with vulnerability management.
Hold on. Time.
Did somebody tell you about it?
Josh is
Wait, time.
Josh's about to mute everybody.
I am about to mute everybody. Before we get to the incident part, let's just talk about what PSIRT is versus a CSIRT. But don't worry about the incident because I think that's worth talking about, though.
Somebody's doing a really excellent podcast about that for First.
Huh. Really?
That'll be in the
You
show
should go
notes.
listen to that.
I wonder who.
Wait, you're double dipping?
Well, so to lay the table out and then let you all crap all over it, CSIRT is either computer security and incident response. I prefer corporate security and incident response. That's a traditional information security team that protects the assets of a corporation.
Yep, I like the
Then
word.
you have
corporate.
PSIRT, which is product security and incident response team, which we all represent. We are focused on the security of a product, and we have more interactions with the customers, and we are less concerned about the corporation.
We are external.
We're concerned about
facing.
brand. We're
Right.
an agent of brand protection, but we really don't care about the firewalls and the logs and stuff.
We are
Screw
external
InfoSec.
facing. We interact with security researchers and external entities. Whereas
So do CSIRTs, though.
Sure. But for the purpose of securing products, whereas CSIRTs are mostly internal focused. They're the ones that handle incidents within your own organization.
Right. And
Right.
I always
so
like
what happens? I think the question really happens is it's like, or that I go to is where I struggle with is what happens if it was a customer incident
That's
that
their
happened?
A customer incident, what?
So are we moving on to incident now?
No,
Is that-
well, I mean, it's part of it.
What
I'm
does the
okay with
customer
what
have
we
an
said
incident
so
with?
far.
So,
The incident part is really the part that bothers me. Is if there was an incident that happened, whether it was to the company or a customer, the only time PSIRT would actually be involved is if it was because of a vulnerability in a product and to address that aspect. But the actual investigation of the incident is not normally a PSIRT thing.
So let's just one more second about the PSIRT versus CSIRT. These are two industry terms that are used. They're I think they've been cemented in our industry to define a separation between the enterprise security arm of a company or a vendor and the the organization that focuses on the products or services or solutions that a company produces,
Right.
the vulnerabilities that are in that, right? And then
CSIRT was first, and then all of a sudden we're like, wait, we need the product security side, and oh, we might as well call them PSIRT to rhyme with CSIRT. But is it really the right acronym?
Yes.
Really? Because you don't want to call it like vulnerability management or vulnerability response, or
in your small little world, maybe you just do that. But some of us have a larger mission. We're more holistic.
this is why I
Our
knew it'd
mission
be
to
fun.
protect
I
the
did
corporation.
mention your name when I brought up the topic. I knew it'd be fun because I know you
but
have a different view.
But in the CSIRT world, though, and when people are investigating breaches, an incident has a very specific definition, right?
I could give you that.
I would love for you to give us that definition.
According to ITIL, an incident is an unplanned interruption to an IT service or reduction of quality of an IT service or a failure of a configuration item that has not yet impacted that IT service. Basically, it's a problem.
I don't like that. I like the definition Josh has. Josh, what's your definition?
I
like Josh's definition too. I'll go for it.
All right,
so certified ITIL professional, I think that's a great definition.
Definition that I had was an occurrence that actually or potentially jeopardizes the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an information system, or the information system, or the information the system processes, stores, transmits, or that constitutes a violation or imminent threat of violation of security policies, security procedures, or acceptable use policies.
We better edit this and put these definitions up over us because
they're going in the show notes. They're going in the show notes.
We're going in our notes.
From a CSIRT perspective, you are typically bound by a firewall. There is some definition of things you're responsible for, and that's extended to cloud when you have the SaaS aspect of things. Mm-hmm. And historically, for a CSIRT, an incident tends to be predominantly availability. Something is down. It can be, oops, I clicked the link in the spear phishing email and I just gave away the CEO's password. But predominantly with a CSIRT, an incident's going to generally be a lot of more availability.
Well,
yeah, but
whereas from a PSIRT perspective, availability is a factor, but that's generally not the sexiest.
But where, if there's an incident that happens, customer or internally, who does the investigation in your company?
It depends.
Does PSIRT ever?
They can, yes.
Hang on. I think so. Yeah. If they could. So here's a situation. Let me give you an example.
I don't know, Katie. Come on. I think you're on my side here. I'm sort of tagging up. Let's go.
I'm come see, come saw. A little of this, a little of that. You know.
So here's the thing, right? Use an example of you are a company, an entity that has IP, and somebody
intellectual property
protocol address.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, intellectual property. You have some company secrets that you do not want to have exposed to the outside.
Secret. I've got a secret.
So somebody is able to break through your firewall, your magical firewall of unicorns and strawberries, and they break through and they're able to steal this information. Now that information, well, first you have an incident where somebody has broken through your firewall somehow and stolen this information. The other element to that, or the other impact there, could be the information itself is sensitive, right? So now you've taken something that isn't yours, something that's confidential, and you've now pulled it outside of the comfy little secure environment that it was in, and now your customers could be exposed because of vulnerabilities that were documented in that. And now PSIRT needs to be involved in investigating that. Crow?
So
correct.
Typically, if there is some type of data breach, that's going to be handled by the CSIRT, the Internal Information Security Team, because that's what they're trained to do. They're subject matter experts. They will be trained in typically forensics or have contacts with a third party to come in and do that forensic analysis, because the company has to determine what is our goal with this investigation. Are we looking to stop the bleeding, stop the incident, or do we want to prosecute? And those have different goals, and that's typically an expertise outside of the CSIRT. But it depends on kind of what your corporate mission is. If you're a small company and you have one lady or gentleman that is the security for the company, you may have these multiple hats you have to wear and juggle. But generally, CSIRT would be brought in as like a subject matter expert. Like, hey, I think we feel they got in through a exploit of a vulnerability in our product. You know, we use our own products on the edge, and that's how we think this attack got executed. So generally, we get brought in as an expert, but that isn't a be-all, end-all. But that you need to get that worked out. You need to have very clear roles and responsibilities about when you have this type of a formal capital I incident, who does what and where, what's the chain of communication.
I completely agree with that. You need to have it laid out. Do what? I think it just might be that different companies approach this of who's the leader different ways. My view is that if there's an incident internally or with a customer, that CSIRT is traditionally not the leader, but brought in if the issue occurred because of a vulnerability. But I'm okay that other teams may do it differently. It's just more, like you said, making sure that it's documented of how you're going to do it so that you don't make it up when you're actually going through one.
I'm going to say something really frightening. I actually think you're all agreeing with each other because ultimately that, you know, CSIRT would lead the way in the investigation of a breach.
Probably.
And CSIRT would
Yes.
be the subject matter expert if
Exactly.
needed. Right. Yeah. I think that's
I just don't like to say that I deal with incidents. I mean,
But you do. When somebody gives you a vulnerability report, that is potentially an incident.
yeah. So on that
And
note,
you are managing that. You're the incident
most
response.
vulnerabilities
And that
are
response is
not
normally a
active
patch.
incidents.
chill. All right. Calm. So, all right. So on that note, what other terminology can you all think of that people should be aware of kind of as we wrap up the show?
Fun fact, second party, third party.
We did talk about that last time. We should just bring it up real quick because I really liked it.
Yeah.
Katie, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh,
sure.
oh no. Josh has got to bring it up because I don't remember what the definition is. Has anybody ever heard? We talked about this before, right? Like, what is a second party?
So
like,
that
I have
comes from
never heard of a.
contracts.
Never
Yes,
heard of it.
right. But let me finish my thought before you interrupt me. Very rarely do we hear the term second party. I had never heard of it before until we looked it up. Third party you hear of all the time, like third party suppliers. They're the ones that you get your external components from, right? But second party, I had never heard of. So what's the definition of second party?
It comes from the law where you have the first party, which is typically a supplier, and the other person that enters a contractual agreement is that second party. And then the third party is some rando that's also involved.
Give us an example. You know, make up an example for us.
So I sell my widget to Lisa. Being the seller, I'm the first party. Lisa is the second party. And you'll see that in the language. You'll see first and second party in the contract. And then the third party is a external
so that would be Katie,
resource for this
who actually
transaction.
maybe produces part of the component that you sell to Lisa, right?
I would like to see that second party means it's within my company but outside of my team, and a third party is external from my company.
That's what I thought
source.
that it meant as well. When we looked it up, that's what I think it means as well. That second party is within your company but not in your within your company but not your section or not your team, and the third party is outside completely. So you get, say, silicate or pieces from a third party supplier, and then your team and another team, you get other things from other places within your own organization, right? And that's what second and third party. That's what I understood it.
I think that makes sense. I don't use it my terminology is a third party is anybody outside of your team. So even if it's like part of my company, code, but outside of the team, we still call them a third party. But I sort of like the idea of the second party. Maybe I'll introduce it in the future standard of mine or policy, but it makes sense if we.
So is this like one of those sections where we say, again, if you use the term second party, let us know how you use it?
Yeah, I think so, because I want to start using it. I sort of think
Probe knows.
In the legal realm, it is a thing, defined standard. It's an agreement between, you have a contract between two entities.
Yeah,
And
but we've been
second
I
talking
would
about
say within internal
And then when you look
entities,
at
you don't
data
normally have a
management,
contract though.
when you look at data, like specifically, it's really used a lot with data.
Yeah. But
second party data.
This sort of brings up actually a good element to this as we close out the show, that while every industry and every group has their own terminology that they use and they define, there's sometimes a need to adopt terminology that other organizations or other industry groups use, so that you have better continuity between the interactions that you have. So the legal field has definitions for those terms. I don't know that the cybersecurity field should create new terms for those, because it would create a disconnect in the communications, and then we would have to create yet another term in order to bring those together, or potentially create another term for that to join those together to make them make sense. So I think that's an interesting part to this, and I think for anybody that's listening, be aware that you're gonna have to deal with a bunch of different types of definitions, because there are a lot of different organizations within the cybersecurity field that are trying to do the right thing and come up with a standardized way to communicate. And there's an ongoing effort for groups to create better definitions for greater clarity. So learning these different definitions is important, and knowing the organizations that you could participate in to help define the future.
No, you're right. Like when you're going to put a contract together, don't try to make your own definitions. Go to FIRST, go to NIST, go somewhere.
Talk to your legal team.
Yeah, like
you're not a lawyer.
Yeah, well,
Maybe.
No, but I'm saying take the ones that are used in the major organizations already, in industry organizations. So yeah, all good.
All right. Well, with that, now's the time to say goodbye to all our family. I want to thank everyone for listening, taking the time out of your busy day to join us, and hope you learned something. And if you have something to share, something you didn't agree with, or something you think we could do differently, or a topic you want to hear, reach out to us.